Are Halloween movies ranked? Well, the greatest Hollywood movies ranked. Um, so, like I said, I'm gonna explain how we're gonna do this. We're gonna do it the typical S tier situation. S tier being obviously top of the top, next level, excellent. A, B, C, D, and F, like your grades. You know, typical grading system with S tier being that next step above A. Um, I don't think there's gonna be many movies that are gonna hit S, but based on our criteria, we'll see. Like I said, I have 50, 50, 50 horror movies lined up for us to talk about. And yes, I've pretty much seen every single one of them throughout my life. Um, some I might have only seen one time long ago, but we'll get there when we get there. For the most part, I've pretty much seen every one of these movies. And our criteria when it comes to scoring these things are gonna go like this. So we're gonna rank these movies obviously based on impact, the impact they had when they first released, the impact and influence that it still continues to have on the overall culture and zeitgeist and the horror genre as a whole. Longevity, films that have spawned multiple sequels, multiple spinoffs over a length of period are obviously going to get a little of a higher bump because of, that's a very hard thing to do. Their relevance, overall relevance to the genre as a whole, whether you came along and you changed things, and if that still continues to be a shift or a thing that we still see in the genre, in the modern genre today, if they still kind of go back and touch on some of the things that those movies did. Obviously, number one of the top criteria is going to be scare level. Overall general scare level. Now, from person to person, it's going to be different, obviously, but I'm going to base it on mine. And like I said, as a kid, I grew up literally watching scary movies since I was probably like 5 years old. So my scare level meter is definitely gauged to a higher level. So what some people might find scary, I might have thought very dumb and just whatever. But it's my list, my criteria, so it's gonna be based on mine. And I have very high bar when it comes to actual scariness of a film, and that can be of anything. That can be with scare jumps. That can be with tension. That can be with the psychological warfare, all the tricks they play on your mind and everything. So I'm gonna kind of try to take everything into consideration because not every horror movie is the same. Originality is another one of the criteria. How original was the idea? Were there a lot of movies out there like it already? Such and such. And when it comes to these franchises, because it is horror, and there are some major franchises out there, I'm not going to go through every single one of those movies because that would be a ridiculous, never-ending, discussion, basically. So I'm just going to judge the franchise as a whole. And if the franchise happens to dip in quality along the way, that is going to impact how I view that franchise. Universe building. In terms of, are there spinoffs? Are there sequels? Are there prequels? Such and such. Because I think that is a sign of something that worked extremely well. If you can get a spinoff, if you get a prequel out of something, that is worth noting and mentioning. So yeah, so that's that's my general criteria when it comes to judging these movies and how I'm going to rank them. Now, if I happen to feel a little bit differently about the rankings along the way, we'll see. But as of right now, that's how I'm going to do things. So, without further ado, let's just get right into it, huh? So as you can see, we have S, A, B, C, D, and F tiers. And we're just going to go and get into it and talk about it. And starting things out, number 1, randomly picked it, but Amityville Horror. So interesting kind of personal tale about Amityville Horror. My mother, a lot of people on my mom's side, cousins, relatives, grew up in Long Island, are from Long Island, and Amityville in particular. So this one, even before I saw the movie, I kind of had a knowledge and connection to this story beforehand because this was kind of told to me. Now, it was never really clarified if she's went to school, particularly with this kid who perpetrated this act, but I think she was. For those that know, Amityville Horror is based on a true story, as in there was a kid in Amityville who literally did murder his entire family, and his defense in the whole thing was that a demon told him to do it, and supposedly the demon is haunting the house. They still do tours there. I've actually been in there. Did I feel anything? No, but it is creepy. It's just creepy to be in a place that something so horrible happened. Now, the movie itself, I forget when it came out. Let me see. 1979 was the initial run of when it came out. Starred James Brolin and overall, it was an impactful movie. It was definitely an impactful. When we're talking about impact, it definitely had an impact because it was also about a very real story that happened. Now, the demon part, that's up for discussion, but a family did get murdered there, and making a movie about that, obviously, its impact is going to be huge. So, in terms of impact, it's undeniable. Had a huge impact. In terms of influence, the movie did kind of have an influence because you did kind of see those haunted house, demon haunted properties to come afterwards. Now, was it the original film to do that? I don't know, and I don't think so. But in terms of like as a touchstone for that kind of genre of horror, it is very original in that sense. Now, scare level, I'd say mild, medium, nothing crazy. But there was good tension, good build up. So I put it in the B category. Definitely give it a B ranking out of considering of all the things it did. Next movie, what do I want to do? Yeah, let's do this. Final Destination. Like I said, we're going to be judging these also based on just overall franchise. And Final Destination, I don't even know how many movies they've made of Final Destination at this point. Now, it's not like a straight up horror movie, but in terms of like thriller, suspense, that anticipation of, you know, that death on film, that somebody could die at any moment, it does ratchet things up extremely well. And it was, and in terms of originality, I think it was extremely original, because I can't think of a movie premise that was kind of like that in any way before that. It was almost like a choose your own adventure story, or like a short story that you would see on like Goosebumps or something like that, just turned into a full-on film. And while, so there's five, no, six. And while the quality diminished massively over its long run as a franchise, the original was very impactful and had people talking about it for a long time. And like I said, it was definitely a very original concept. And I think they did a really good job, at least initially, of realizing it and bringing the film. So I would put it in the C tier. Let's do Suspiria. Dario Argento, same name, Dario, Italian director, very famous, one of the most famous Italian directors, and a very well known in the horror genre field, community, whatever. He's considered kind of a master of it. And I would say out of all of his films, this is his most well known. It was a wild film, to say the least. It was definitely a wild film. It has to do with like witches in a nutshell. It deals with witches and an unsuspecting female student. I believe it was ballet school. Ballet student, and their teachers are witches. And I think obviously the concept of witches isn't original really at all. They've gone back a really long time, but in the way that he presented it, it was extremely original, especially in film form, and the way he shot things, the way he presented the tension, the way the suspense was ratcheting up. It was very original in that sense. And it even managed to get a remake, which obviously didn't live up to the original, which is almost impossible to do, especially in this genre. But it has a lasting impact in that sense, in terms of uniqueness. There hasn't really been another film to kind of hit that same beat that he managed to hit on this one. And I'd put it in the B tier. Now, this is one that I think pretty much everybody knows. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Leatherface. He is very well known in the halls of horror. Now, the original was an indie film, shot pretty much all black and white, low budget, but I think that low budget is also what made it feel so just kind of creepy and off-putting. The weird ass family that, people, especially in like certain parts of America, could kind of relate to and see as a possibility. made things feel even more like kind of unsettling. And then when you introduce Leatherface himself with the chainsaw revving and the crazy kills and everything, it was a deeply unsettling movie. Especially the original. Now, the follow-ups, terrible. Terrible. I don't think I've seen one sequel from Texas Chainsaw Massacre I thought was like, oh, that was okay. They were all pretty bad. So the fallout from the original has been drastic. So that's going to knock it a lot. But the original itself stands up extremely well. Even to this day, extremely well. So because of that, I would have to put you as a B tier franchise. Now, The Witch. This is one that it's either a you love it or you hate it type of movie. It's very unique. Again, concept of witches isn't original or particularly unique, but the way they present things, the way they shoot things, the way the setting is, it's a very slow movie, very slow burn. It's more psychological than any other type of horror, but it definitely makes you think. You don't really know what's going on. You don't know what's true, what's not. And in terms of that suspense and thrill, I think they nailed it. They nailed that part of it for sure. It was a critical darling for sure. It kind of has that high snobby feeling that critics love. Like it's almost like elevated horror, a term that I've heard used. But in terms of like horror and scare levels, very low for me. Very low in terms of scareness. I thought it was more of an interesting watch than an uneasy one or unsettling one. I think the way they presented witchcraft and the whole concept of like witches, particularly in like that New England area and time period when that was a big thing, that Puritan, concept of witches was very interesting and well done, but it was super slow. And I don't really think the payoff was that amazing. And because of that, in terms of horror movies, I'm going to put you in a C. Now, in terms of artistry, I'd put it higher, but in terms of horror, it's a C or below. The Wicker Man. It exists in a very unique subgenre of horror, that kind of folk cult horror that you don't really see a ton of because it's very hard to do and it's very hard to pull off. It's not a straight horror and there's no real jump scares. It just kind of builds up tension and that feeling of uneasiness and that there's just something off about these people in this community. And they did a really good job of that. And in terms of like British horror, this is considered kind of one of the best examples of British horror that have ever come out. So its impact and influence, which we'll talk about with some other films later, is kind of still felt today. More so with people that are fans of the actual genre, maybe not like mainstream film watchers or horror film watchers, but for people that know about horror, you can still see its influence on other films today, one of which I will talk about soon. But other than that, I don't think it's more of a cult. I mean, it's about a cult, obviously, but it's definitely a cult film. it didn't really have that massive reach or impact outside of, people who are in the know. Now, there was a remake, and it did give us one of the greatest memes and acting moments of all time from one Nicolas Cage. And I think it's only right that we play it for you guys, because it's just too good. The remake is absolutely dog shit and terrible, but Nick Cage alone makes it worth seeing. So here's a little 30 seconds of Zen from one Nicolas Cage.
What is that? What is that? What is it?
Oh wait, let me 30 seconds. Nick Cage and the Wicker Man remake. Not the bees.
No, not the bees. Not the bees. Ah! Oh, my eyes. My eyes. Ah! Ah!
So yeah. That was the remake, and it was awful. Nick Cage made it worth seeing, but it was awful. So again, not very scary, uneasy, unsettling, weird, but not very scary. But in terms of like that kind of culty folk horror, it was kind of like the pioneer of that, one of the best examples of that. So in that reason alone, I'll give it a C. Put it on C tier. The Thing, starring Mr. I believe Kurt Russell himself, from let's say John Carpenter, 1982. Let me double check and make sure I'm right. Starring Kurt Russell. Yeah, directed by John Carpenter. I'm correct. In terms of originality, this is one of the most original horror films to have ever come out, and still out today. It's not a subject that gets talked a lot about in horror in terms of like alien, otherworldly. They try, but in a very different way. This is very grounded. It's very unique. The way they shot it was incredible. There wasn't special effects, a ton of CGI. It was all practical effects for the most part. And the way that they presented the Thing in all his different forms still lives in my mind to this day. I can clearly picture that head scampering along the ground with like 9 little spider legs crawling out of it. It was fucked up, to say the least. It was fucked up, but it was definitely impactful, and it leaves a mark. It left a huge mark on me in terms of like the things it was presenting and the concept it was presenting. And to me, it's one of John Carpenter's best movies, and it's one of Kurt Russell's best movies. I think it's an all-time classic. They tried to remake it, and it was, again, dog shit. So I can't really knock it for that, because it's not a sequel. Remake is absolutely shitty. It's one of those rare horror films that kind of stand alone. I don't really see how you could do a sequel or prequel and do it any real justice. And it deserves to be in its own standalone experience. and experienced in the original way. So as you could tell, like I love this movie. I think everybody should see The Thing, and I think it's one of the greatest horror films ever made. And in terms of that, it's getting the first S tier. It's S tier, baby. It's Kurt fucking Russell and John Carpenter in a body horror alien movie. S tier. Absolutely S tier. Let's do the one that I'm sure everybody knows where it's pretty much going to go. Stanley Kubrick, The Shining. There's not a lot I can say about this movie that hasn't been said a million times. It's phenomenal. It's an all-time great movie, not just horror movie. It's one of Jack Nicholson's most memorable roles, one of the most memorable scenes in cinema history, which is a lot saying considering Jack Nicholson has so many memorable roles in huge movies. But The Shining is just one that always kind of people gravitate to when it comes to horror. And it's not just crazy. The scare level, I don't think is that off the chart. There's no scare jumps. It's all pretty much psychological for the most of the movie. But to see him kind of like descend into that madness even more and then let things just go off the rails at the end is just, it's immaculate. It's Stanley Kubrick, obviously, iconic, legend. One of his best films as well. And while I understand why Stephen King personally hates his adaptation of his work because it changes so many fundamental things about the book, it's one of those rare instances where it was the right call for this film. And I think it was, it's not massively scary for me, but it's one of the just best watches you'll get from anything in this genre. S tier without a doubt. Let's get into some more recent movies. Us from Jordan Peele, who also has another movie on this list that I want to talk about. This came out following Get Out, his big break into Hollywood, into the zeitgeist, into the filmmaking community as a whole. This was highly anticipated. People couldn't wait to see what he was going to do next, and this is what he came with. And while I think it's extremely original and almost as unique in terms of tone, his voice, the way he uses modern music, it's very unique in that sense in this genre. It's not like a straight up horror. It's kind of horror light. And while there are some tense moments to begin with, those moments kind of dissipate fairly early on. And I don't think things ever get back to that like intensity level that you would expect from a horror film. But it was a fun watch, overall fun watch. It's not one that I've particularly gone back to or felt the need to go back to. But after one watch, I was like, oh, that was cool. And that's pretty much how I feel about it. It's cool, but it's not, if I never saw it again, that'd probably be okay. So that is definitely a D tier. It's cool for all the things I mentioned, but it's not a particularly great horror film overall. Get Out. So this was the movie that broke Jordan Peele himself. The one that it's the one that put him on the map outside of Key and Peele. It's the one that made everybody look and take notice and take him seriously as a director, a creative, a filmmaker, all the above. It was highly unique. It was a social, racial commentary as much as it was a horror movie or thriller, which is what I consider it more than just a horror. The horror is like a racial based horror that a lot of people in the Black community fully understood and fully got, and the subtle things that he would say and do with certain characters in this film. It wasn't particularly scary, and when you saw where things are going, you kind of had an understanding of where this movie would be going. So there weren't like a ton of surprises. The ending was satisfying, though. I thought he was going to go a much darker route, darker in the sense of not really getting true justice. But I'm glad he went the route he did. And in terms of impact, it's undeniable the impact that he's had on modern horror films and how directors, filmmakers, and creators think and approach it, and also what studios are willing to do. You can see it. They weren't like direct spinoffs of him and his work, but their impact was clearly seen and felt with Amazon's Day series, Candyman, the new remake of Candyman, which he helped produce, but he did not direct or screenwrite for. So you could definitely see, I saw more people in trailers using these modern pop, hip hop, R&B records and flipping them in new, cool, and interesting ways for trailers. So his impact was undeniable. Get Out was probably the biggest movie in terms of the culture as a whole of that year. And I think it's all well deserved. I think it's a bit overhyped and overblown for what it truly was, but as an unexpected surprise from Jordan Peele, I think it was amazing in that sense. And the things that he was able to do, the commentary he was able to put into the movie was amazing. But in terms of horror, like I said, the scare levels very low. Tension wasn't super crazy, but it's undeniable to not really think and take into account its impact. So between S and A, it was a hard guess, hard decision, but it's got to go in A. It just wasn't scary enough. Was not that scary, but it's a great movie. Right. Silence of the Lambs. Again, it's one of those movies that I don't think I have to like say too much about. You've either seen it or you know all about it. It was that big in the cultural zeitgeist. You see references to it. You see parodies of it. You just see it in the culture so much, even to this day. So its impact was absolutely massive. Mr. Anthony Hopkins, this put him on the map, even more so than anything else he's ever done. His role was so iconic. His back and forth between Clarice herself, Miss Jodie Foster, was just perfect. The acting was phenomenal. It was unsettling in a psychological way more so than any other way. I think it really hit on like that serial killer vibe in a way that no movie before it had ever done. And I don't think many movies ever since have really hit that particular level. And like I said, its impact on the culture is still felt to this day. It's still talked about, still referenced, it's still parodied. It's still very much part of the popular mind. So it's undeniable its impact. I don't I don't know, in terms of scariness, I don't know, it's like medium level in terms of like that tension, that uneasiness of just how cold and calculating his character was. He just seemed like he was always a step ahead, but it wasn't particularly just heart pounding, heart stopping scary, but it was undeniably a great watch, and its impact and influence on all the movies to come afterwards, undeniable. Um, Sequels, not very good, so you're not good for that. But in terms of overall franchise, man, it was one of the best to do it still. So S tier. The Ring. Um, this was a very interesting movie to consider. On two fronts. One, it is a remake or adaptation of a Japanese film called Ring, um, which I have not seen the Japanese version, so I can't really speak to how good that version was. But in general, I pretty much always assumed that the original country version was the superior version. It's probably far more interesting, far more unique in the things it was trying to do. Obviously, when you get to Hollywood and you deal with these big studios and productions, they're going to fuck with your vision, your idea, and they're going to Hollywood it up. They're going to do what they think is going to be the most mass appeal, whereas I think the original film was probably more subculturally, more obscure, more unique, more weird. So I can't really speak to the OG Japanese version, but I can speak to the American version. And I say it was unique to consider because at the time it came out, it was huge. Its impact was huge when it first came out. I remember kids all throughout school talking about it. Have you seen it? Have you seen The Ring? Its concept was very, very original, very unique. The main villain, main whatever, however you want to say it, main antagonist was different than pretty much anything else that Hollywood was putting out in terms of horror movies up to that point. It was either slasher or like some goofy character version of, like Freddy Krueger, Jason, something in that type of lane. But in this was very Japanese. It was just like a little girl, very dark black hair, long black hair covering her face for most of the movie, saying they're creepy. That's it. That was it for the most part. There were some very cool moments, some decent jump scares. Tension was solid. So in terms of like horror and scary movies, in terms of modern scary movies, I think it was pretty high level, especially at the time it came out. And I think for a very short window, it did influence a lot of other horror movies to come following it. You can definitely see Hollywood trying to reach for like something like that in that lane again, because Hollywood is all about copycats and doing what worked anyways. Nothing really ever hit that same level again. And while I said the impact was very strong when it first hit, I think it dissipated relatively quickly. And I don't really think it's very much in the general zeitgeist in terms of film and horror and all that today. So you have to take that into account. But overall, I in terms of modern Hollywood horror films, I think it was definitely one of the better ones to have ever come out in the past few decades. So for that reason, it's either A or B. I'm gonna give it a B tier. I'm gonna give it a B tier. But it's like B plus. It's like B plus. I don't think people give it enough credit. I think it's shit on because it got so popular for, you know, reasons beyond its control. And I don't necessarily think that just because a horror movie's popular doesn't mean that it's bad. It's just a weird thing within horror. The more popular it is, typically the more people shit and hate on it. So I don't want to talk about each individual movie that Universal Studios has put out in terms of like their monsters. They're very well known. I don't really think I need to speak about them individually. You can just look at them and kind of point and know who they are, what they do, what they're about. Now, in hindsight, looking back, obviously, on these past older versions of a lot of these characters, in terms of Frankenstein, Dracula, the Wolfman, Invisible Man, they don't obviously stand up, but those are extremely old movies. But in the period that they came out, they were cutting edge. And they basically invented the horror genre in terms of film. And obviously, the impact of these characters is still ongoing, still long lived, still very much in our popular vernacular and consciousness. So, in terms of that, it can be nothing else but S tier. So we are going a little older, so I'm gonna stick in that kind of realm right now. Talk about Psycho. Alfred Hitchcock. One of the, if not the most memorable scene in any movie in all of cinema is the shower scene. I don't even think I need to describe it to you. You probably are already picturing it in your mind today. Now, it's debatable whether this really kicked off the whole slasher film genre. It's undeniable that it is the most important moment in terms of that subgenre of horror and thriller and that slasher field. Undeniable. The most important movie to have come out in terms of what we get. It kind of shaped all the movies to come after it that were in that lane. There are direct callbacks all the time to this movie. And I mean, I don't really think I need to say more about that. It's S tier. It's one of the greatest movies ever made, horror or not. It's an S tier movie alone. Now the other one he did, The Birds. Looking back at it now, obviously it's a little cheesy, a little kind of like, oh, this is what people were kind of losing their mind about. But at the time, you had to take into consideration that when it came out, it was cutting edge. It was unique. It almost felt like an Edgar Allan Poe story come to life. And it kind of started that you take an innocent creature, innocent character, and you flip it. And you turn it into this serious major threat. And how many movies have done that since then? 1 million. Take an innocent creature, animal, whatever, person, child, and you flip it. And that's the scary part right there. While it's not a particularly scary movie, especially by today's standards, it was a trendsetter and it was a pioneer, and he is a pioneer. And I don't think it's anywhere near the quality of, like, say, Psycho. It is still an A-tier horror movie when you look back and see all the influences that have come from it since then. Let's let's do some Stephen King. Here's a little obscure one that not everybody's seen, but it's one that I always recommend people to see. It was a short story from Stephen King that I think he's got to be the most adapted writer of all time by this point. It's insane the amount of TV shows, movies, and other properties that have been adapted of his work. Now, The Mist is unique. It's a Stephen King story, so it's original. All his writing is pretty original. Maybe not the entire concept in terms of, like, otherworldly, other dimension beings crossing over, creating havoc, and all this. But the setting that he puts it in, and the characters that he was able to create and write, and the way they get displayed on film, were great. I think it's one of his better adaptations. If you are a fan of The Walking Dead, you will notice a lot of those characters are in this movie. Well, actors, a lot of those actors are in this movie, and this is the first movie that I've seen them in. I believe it's Thomas Jane in there as well as, like, the main lead. Scare level, not particularly high, but I also personally don't find monsters in movies to be that scary in general, because I always think the moment you see them, that level of terror is immediately gone. But that's one interesting thing that they did do about this movie and the story as a whole, is that you don't actually see them for a long period of time. You don't really know what is out there until they do start to see them towards the end. And the real scare, the real terror comes from the people within the story that they're locked in. And the way he shows and portrays how in that small group of people, that tribalism that begins to take hold almost immediately, and you see the darker side of people come out of them almost immediately. I think that part was phenomenal. The real horror didn't come from the outside of these other dimensions. It came from the people that you are stuck in this situation with, and that was perfect. And I don't think it's the best produced movie, the most well acted movie, but I do love the story and the concept. And I love the ending. It was a very controversial ending, very different from the book. Not everybody liked the ending. It is particularly dark, but I think that ending just nailed the overall feeling of hopelessness of the situation. And it's an ending that still sticks with me to this day. And I think it sticks with a lot of people to this day. And that says a lot. So, in horror, not the scariest movie, but I think in super underrated film overall, B tier. Blair Witch Project. Now, I don't know how many of viewers, watchers, listeners have were around when this movie first hit, still have recollections of the mass hysteria this movie caused when it first hit. Its impact was absolutely massive, huge for such a small budget film. I think they were running news segments about this, about parents literally taking this movie seriously. Because the big thing was that this was a found footage film. And I think maybe the first major found footage film to ever hit theaters. And when it did, people literally took this movie as a true recording. I distinctly remember people talking about the Blair Witch Project in school as being real and true. And for that alone, you have to just it was ingenious. Absolutely ingenious. Now, the movie itself, not particularly good. I was going to say not particularly scary, but I'm going to take that back. The tension and the uneasiness and the feeling of something is very off here is very high in this movie. Now, as the movie goes on, you start to kind of lose that tension and that feeling and that believability. But for a good chunk of the beginning parts of the movie, it was there and it was nailing it. Now, the ending, very controversial. Some people like it, some people don't. I particularly didn't care for it myself. But man, the impact of this movie was insane. Its influence is insane. You know how many found footage horror movies there are nowadays? You can almost point directly to this movie as being the reason why those movies exist at all. So, how do you rank that? Not particularly scary. Not particularly great of a movie, but its impact and influence, it was ground breaking in terms of theater and studio horror films. So because of that, because of those two factors alone, I have to put it in the A tier. Not a particularly scary movie, but its influence is undeniable. Now, this might be a controversial pick for some people, but it's one of my favorite horror movies of all time. That's right, of all time. Whenever somebody asks me what is a good horror movie to watch, I ask them, have you seen The Descent? And if they say no, you go watch The Descent tonight. I watched this movie in theaters in high school, not knowing anything about this movie. Didn't see a trailer. It wasn't a particularly big budget movie, so they didn't do a ton of promotion, a ton of lead up to it. But it was definitely during that time period where people were just going to the movie theaters for something to do. And we just happened to me and my friends happened to stumble upon this movie one night. And I was just taken aback. Like I said, I grew up on horror movies. So for a long period there, I never really felt that feeling of, oh shit, from a movie for a long time. I was kind of like desensitized and still am desensitized to a lot of like horror films these days. But this fully shook me out of that in that theater. In terms of originality, It's extremely original, stands on its own, super unique. I can't think of any other horror film where the lead cast is entirely women. Not just women, badass women who can, for the most part, hold their own in most situations. And I don't want to spoil things, but they go cave diving, exploring, which in itself is a terrifying prospect. You're going into the complete, absolute unknown, unstable, smallest, tightest situations you can find yourself in. So then they take that and then they ratchet it up even more with the introduction of some other antagonists. And then on top of that, they throw in a ton of psychological fucking with you towards the end, in particular between certain characters. And then you really realize at the end, oh, the title has multiple meanings for this story. And it's just perfect. There is a sequel, never seen it, never going to see it. And there is an alternate ending, which kind of ruins the mystique and magic, I think, of the ambiguous, more open ending that they had in theaters. But man, this was horror, modern horror, done absolutely right. And it was elevated horror as well. You got everything. You got the psychological warfare. You got the gore. You got the tension. You got the claustrophobia. The no light. Oh, it was just amazing. S tier. No question. And like I said, if you're a person who hasn't seen The Descent, go see The Descent. Can't think of a better movie to watch over Halloween. Hills Have Eyes. This is another weird one because I never saw. It's directed by Wes Craven, for one, who is arguably the godfather of horror, the master of modern horror. But I never got to see the original version of this, which was 1977. I did see the remake, so I can only judge this franchise movie based on that version, the modern version, and it's absolutely dog shit. The concept is fairly unique, kind of, but it's also does the well-worn trope of this group of people, hill people, are different, weird, inbred kind of, but they kind of flip it. But basically inbred hill people that you should be afraid of, that are weird, that are different, and they play on those natural fears I think we all kind of have. And they do it in an absolutely ludicrous way. This movie is absolutely ludicrous. Now, I know it has its fans, but I don't understand how this movie sucked. It was full of... Here's why it's hard to judge. Because the original was probably far more unique and original when it first came out. The remake not so much, because by the time we got to that point, all those tropes that it does have been done to death. And it just did all those in a far worse way. And I didn't find it particularly scary. I didn't find it scary at all. I actually found myself laughing in this movie a lot. Not intentionally. It's not intentionally funny, but the situations that they present and put these characters in and how they react to them, absolutely ludicrous. So for me, as much as I love Wes Craven, it's F tier for me. That movie sucked. The Exorcist. It's kind of one of those, again, one of those rare movies that absolutely just breaks barriers, enters the zeitgeist, and grips on so much to a point that whether you've seen it or not, you know it. You know the movie. You know what it's about. You can probably picture the scenes, or you've seen the scenes in some way, shape, or fashion, whether that be in a trailer, in a movie, in a parody, somewhere, somehow, it's been referenced and you've seen it. And I don't know if this was the first of its kind, but it is definitely the most notable of its kind, dealing with the demonic, the religious, the whole possession trope. This is it. When people point, this is the movie. And when it first came out, its impact was huge. People everywhere were talking about it, rightfully so. It was so unique at the time. The effects were world class. The concept is simple, but they take a simple concept and elevate it to such a high level that it became a pinnacle of the horror genre and just our Western cultural zeitgeist in general. S tier, without a doubt. Now, a modern version that kind of falls in line with that, or definitely touches on those same similar tropes, is The Conjuring. They deal with possession, they deal with the demonic, they deal with witches, and it's all based on a true story. They are real people that existed. Now, the stories are real or not, that is up for you to decide. But to me, this is one of the greatest modern horror movies to have come out in the past, decade? Because it came out, I think, like 2013. Just when there was a severe dearth of good horror films, this came out and proved everybody wrong. Showed that good horror still could be made. I want to say James Wan either produced it or directed, or maybe both. Yeah, he was directed, and he took a very familiar concept with very, very familiar tropes and elevated and still somehow made it worth watching. Not only worth watching, memorable. So memorable, in fact, that it's literally spawned its own universe. It's got two, three sequels now. It's got prequel. It's got spinoffs. Yeah, like it basically McDonaldized horror. Like it's synonymous with modern horror these days. And while it's not original almost in any way, shape, or form, they do it at such a high level that it deserves respect. And while I do think it relies heavily, entirely too much on jump scares and cheap scares, it does them well. It does do them well. It does do a good job of ratcheting up tension and suspense. Like I said, it's nothing original about it. You kind of know where things are going. Well, you definitely know where things are going to be going and headed, but it doesn't make it less fun getting there, and it doesn't ruin the anticipation of what's to come. And the fact that it launched so many other properties and careers and resurged careers, it's undeniable its impact it's had on modern horror. And for that alone, it's got to be A tier. Not particularly original, not original at all, but very, very well done. If you're going to do it, you want it to be at that level for sure. He showed a lot of people how to do modern horror. Cabin in the Woods, and modern horror that can be enjoyed by the masses. The Cabin in the Woods. This is a very unique horror film in that it's not truly a horror film, more so than a commentary on the genre as a whole. Literally. For some people, this is one of the greatest movies that have come out in its time period in terms of horror and modern horror. But I think more so that's because people love the commentary that it was doing on all the tired tropes of horror in general and how they flipped a lot of those concepts on its head. I don't think it ended things well at all. I actually hate the ending. I hate the whole last 30 minutes of the movie in general. But leading up to it, they were doing something so interesting, so unique, so surprising that it definitely had me engaged until you get the full reveal. For me, some people like the reveal. For me, the reveal really took me out of the movie. But I can't deny the things that it was trying to do and how unique it was, and the things that it did do at an extremely high level. It was a fun movie. I think Chris Hemsworth was in this movie as well. So it depends on you and where you are in terms of horror. Not a particularly scary movie, but it is a fun, interesting watch. And for that, it's a B tier movie. Scream. Iconic. One of the most iconic movies to have ever come out in a genre, and by Mr. Wes Craven himself. I think he single-handedly single-handedly revitalized horror and slasher films back to a mainstream level that I wasn't sure that could ever reach again until this came out. People were kind of tired of the horror films and the tired tropes that we were getting. And while he plays into a lot of those same tropes with slasher films and horror films, he does it in a way as more of a commentary, and he does it from such a unique perspective that made this such a enjoyable movie. Now the sequels have, depending on your opinion, they have their high points and they certainly have their low points. I don't think it's lasted particularly well as a franchise, but its influence on modern horror and modern slasher films particularly is undeniable. it single-handedly revitalized the genre at the time. For as simple of a costume and a mask that the antagonist has and uses, it became iconic. I myself, I think, dressed as the Scream Killer one Halloween. So because of that, it's A tier. I cannot give it S tier because I think the drop off as the franchise went on was fairly massive. But it's undeniable the impact it's had on modern horror and modern slasher films as we know them today. Saw. I think maybe outside of like Friday the 13th, this might be the franchise that has the most sequels. It's got to be like 10 or something at this point. This is a hard one to judge because the first one was so unique, so original, so surprising. It took me aback. Like, I just remember watching it and just being slack-jawed by the ending, by the twist, by the surprise, by what they pulled off in such a small budget film. I loved it. I absolutely loved the original. And I even liked the next two. I'll say two. And then things just went into absolutely batshit crazyville. The story makes absolutely no sense now. The character has just gone through so many different iterations that they don't even know what they're doing. They basically traded in the more thinking part of the franchise, the more mind fuckery, and just went all in on the gore and ratcheted up the gore as much as they could. And that was their scary, that was their horror. It doesn't really have that feeling of a horror film anymore. Almost like torture porn. So that drop off was drastic and steep. And as much as I love the first one, I absolutely love the first one. I think the first one is one of the greatest horror films. I don't think it's necessarily a horror, but in that field, I think it's untouchable. But everything else after it was bad, to say the least. And because of that alone, man, I have to put it C tier. The rest of those movies drag down the franchise as a whole so much. All right, we got a lot of these, so I'm gonna rapid fire some of these. Rosemary Baby, I think when it first came out, it had a pretty good impact. Had people talking. I don't think it was particularly scary, but its influence was fairly solid. It was well shot, well acted, and it is memorable. And for that, it's a C tier. Wreck, I believe it was a Spanish-made film, independent film, and it broke through so much that it became recognized in so many different places that a film of this size and budget you wouldn't really expect to. It took the found footage formula and did some very interesting and unique things. The tension was crazy. The sequels are absolutely awful, but the original stands the test of time still to this day, and for that it's a C tier as well. I don't know if you guys remember this franchise, and it is a franchise. Yes, it is a franchise. I want to say there's probably like 3 or 4 of them. Basic concept, kind of a la Child's Play and Chucky. They're puppets brought to life by an evil spell, and they kill people. And they got to do it in a comical way. It was a novel concept, at least, but its execution was not great, and it's good for some laughs though, because that's F, and for that it's F tier. Pet Cemetery, again another Stephen King property, extremely in terms of film and horror film, it's unique and original. It plays on a lot of the fears that a parent, a dad, a father, a mother would have. It plays on those emotions for good reason, because it's written by Stephen King, who also wrote this story, I believe, after his dog was, I think, hit by a car or something like that, maybe, or died. And that desire to see that loved one back alive again. And when kind of plays on that trope, what would you do in that situation? I don't particularly think the movie was scary or necessarily well shot or well done, but it is memorable, and I think it's memorable more so for the movie. I mean, more so for the story than the movie itself. And I believe they've tried multiple times to revitalize and bring it back to a level that I think the story deserves to be at, but I don't think they've ever truly been able to nail it. And for that, it's D tier. This was in that weird 90s period where every horror character antagonist had to be a mascot, more or less. I don't know if you guys have seen this or remember it, but it is absolutely hilarious, comical, intentionally and not intentionally. It's not particularly well shot, but it is a fun watch just because it's one of those, it doesn't really take itself too seriously. And the sequels, it doesn't take itself seriously at all. There's literally a movie called Leprechaun in the Hood. Yes. Leprechaun in the Hood. And this is a horror franchise because he's an evil leprechaun that kills people. And I mean, I'm just gonna say it. One way to kill him, they literally shoot a 4-leaf clover into his mouth with a slingshot. So it's a terrible movie, terrible franchise, but it is good watch. It's one of those movies that you want to put on for your friends to just show them. And people probably won't believe you that exists, but it certainly does. And this is something that got made. And it's something that literally not only got made, got sequels. And if you see the original, you might notice some people, some actors in there that you would not ever expect to see in a movie like this. But Jennifer Aniston comes to mind. I don't know if this was the first feature, but this was definitely one of their first big feature films. and I'm sure she doesn't talk about it much, but she is certainly in this franchise. And to prove my point that oh, what up? Shout out Bossman6996. Yeah, we're talking about horror films. Like I was saying, good man. Good. See if this is coming through. So I wanted to talk about what was that? Oh, Leprechaun the Hood. It's a very real movie, something that truly did happen. And to prove it to you, I'm gonna show you a clip because I think everybody should see this. Yes, that is something that literally got made. This was a literal horror franchise. And it actually who played Leprechaun was Warwick Davis, who played in a lot of things. I think he's in the new Willow franchise on Disney Plus. I want to say he played in Star Wars films as well. Yeah, he was an Ewok. That's what it was. So he plays the Leprechaun, and the Leprechaun is an absolutely shit franchise, but it's undeniably fun to watch. So for trivia, I would definitely bring that up next time. There was a lot of weird movies that came out like late 90s or 2000s, and that was a 2000s movie if I've ever seen one. Jeepers Creepers, this is another weird one. I don't really know how to feel about this one. I think its impact was fairly decent when it came out. A lot of people were talking about it in school. Character design was interesting, at least. I don't think it was very scary. Sequels were shitty. But for, I think, character design, originality, it gets D tier for sure. We were talking about the Scream franchise earlier and a clear influence and basically knockoff of it. What Scream did was literally launch the whole teen horror, teen slasher genre that sprung up out of it. And there was like a lot of very shitty interpretations of what Scream did. And out of all of them, this was one of the better ones. I Know What You Did Last Summer. I think I like Freddie Prinze and Sarah Michelle Gellar. It basically had a lot of attractive teens that were clearly not teens or clearly not in high school running around trying to stop and solve a serial killer. It became a whole genre of Scream. And while this was definitely one of the better ones of those spinoffs, it was still pretty shitty. So that is definitely D tier worthy. Like I said, we're gonna rapid fire some that I don't want to talk about that much. Hellraiser's interesting one. One that you either love, either you love it or you don't. I don't really think there's like a lot of in between in terms of people who are familiar and fans of the franchise. I want to say there's probably like 3 or 4 movies. It even got a quasi remake sequel that is actually getting fairly well reviewed, and I haven't seen it yet, which is something I'm probably gonna have to do this week. In terms of like character design, it was obviously incredibly recognizable and iconic Pinhead, but the movie itself is very strange. Like it's very unique, very original in its concepts of what a horror film could be. It's almost more psychological and body horror than anything else. I don't think it was particularly scary, but it was very unsettling, especially as a young child that was watching this. But I don't really think its impact has been that great. I don't think it's influenced a lot of films to come after it because it was so out there. And I think a lot of films and studios were afraid to even do anything or touch anything that was like it. But it definitely had its good moments, unique moments, and for that I get to C tier. Candyman. This was very unique, especially back in the time period that it came out. There weren't a lot of black horror villains, characters. If you were black in a horror film for the large part, even still to this day, you're probably going to want to be one of the first characters to die. And this one kind of flipped the script where you're not the one. Well, we're not the one that's dying, but the ones that are actually doing the killing. And for that, I think it was I always liked it. And what can I say? I always liked it because it was doing something that you just didn't see. You didn't see a ton of representation in terms of horror films. It was pretty much always the final girl concept, trope, whatever. And everybody kind of played into their roles and their stereotypes. So to see Candyman kind of flip that on its head, I always loved. And it did have subtle social commentary about race in the US. I think the new one has even more overt links and ties to that. So the horror itself, I don't think was, well, it was decently scary. It was definitely suspenseful, at least on the same level of like Friday the 13th or Freddy Krueger. And it did have a lot of kids afraid to literally say Candyman into the mirror. So for that alone, it's B tier. It's a B tier horror. What else we got? Alien. This is literally one of my all-time favorite movies to have ever come out. Yeah, I don't really know what else to say about it. It was one of the first of its kind. It's still super unique and rare to find a space horror, especially one that's like a slow burn like this one. Obviously, it puts Sigourney Weaver in a very iconic position. You didn't really see female leads acting or being portrayed the way she was, as such, basically a badass. But also while still being incredibly scared of the situation. So she wasn't like some superhero. She was just dealing with whatever fucked up situation she found in. And I think that was a very refreshing take. And the visual effects, practical effects were cutting edge at the time. And they still hold up to this day if you will go back and watch it. Alien has obviously spawned into one of the most iconic characters in all of cinema. The next movies take a clear shift away from the sci-fi space horror into more action, but the original one itself was firmly rooted in that thriller, suspenseful horror element. And I mean, Alien's influence is massive among the cinema. I don't think it is particularly large in the horror genre itself. And the first one is such a kind of unique standalone from everything else that followed that it's kind of hard to judge this one based on a horror basis. but it is a phenomenal film and one of my favorites. But in terms of horror tiers, it's got to be B. If we're talking films, S. Horror films, B. All right. 28 days later. There's also 28 weeks later. So this is a little mini franchise. It took something so simple. What if zombies could run? And that's basically its whole concept. And it was based in such a unique setting, the UK, which we don't, at that time period, particularly we for sure, didn't get a ton of films placed in that setting and so unique and authentic feeling to that setting as well. I don't necessarily think it was particularly terrifying, but it was very unique, and you could feel the uneasiness and just tension of the situation to find himself in what would normally be like such a well-populated and thriving area, and to be woken up out of a coma into this. There's zombies going around, but they're not the zombies that we were used to. It was the ones, they're runners. And it was such a subtle, slight change that just opened up so many major doors within the subgenre of horror that is zombie horror. So in that sense, it was very influential, very innovative. But I don't really hear people talk about it much unless they are big into zombies and the horrors. I don't think its impact necessarily in horror films itself has been that massive. Now, in terms of like video games and other properties, I think it has more of an impact. But in terms of horror films, I don't think it's necessarily had the longest running influence and impact on zombies. If you're getting a zombie movie to this day, it is still going to be the typical zombies as you know. So because of that, it is it's a B tier. It's a B tier for me. Since we're talking about zombies, we might as well talk about the OG, Night of the Living Dead. This is the movie that basically single-handedly created the zombie genre as we know it. Directed and created by George A. Romero. This is one of those rare horror films where the sequel actually was much better than the original. Much better. Dawn of the Dead. It was a huge leap from this one to the next one. And its impact as a whole is undeniable. It literally created an entire subgenre of horror that is arguably the biggest section of horror in this day and age. Just think about how many like zombie properties we have, not just in film, but in TV, in video games, in art, in everything. He literally created that. And he doesn't get paid from creating that, which is also crazy. But its impact is undeniable. Looking back, hindsight, and watching this with modern eyes, it's not going to be the scariest movie, but you can see how at the time, how unsettling it would be for people to see. And for the simple fact alone that it literally created and set the guidelines and boundaries for what the zombie horror genre is, it's S tier. We were talking about James Wan earlier with The Conjuring. He also, before he hopped into The Conjuring, he was involved with Insidious series. I want to say there's probably like 3 of these movies now. The lead what's his name? Patrick, forget his name, but the male lead, the dad, he is also in The Conjuring. He's also a male lead. And this is the movie that kind of proved his chops as a horror actor. And if you ask me, I think Insidious is miles above The Conjuring. It's nowhere near as popular or well known, but I think it is miles above what The Conjuring did. It's 1,000 times more original, more unique. The antagonists, plural, are far more unsettling, terrifying, unique, everything. There's great jump scares. There's great tension. It spawned entire careers for actors. It got sequels. I think it got a prequel. It's one of the most underrated modern horror franchises out there today. And if you haven't seen Insidious and you're looking for a good movie to see as a horror film this Halloween, I highly suggest you go see this one. The ending, I think of the first one was one of my favorite endings of any movie of this genre in the past 2 decades at least. For that, it's A tier. Jaws. Now, I myself personally do not really consider Jaws to be a horror film. But if you look at any list, it is always on there as a horror film. And while there's a ton of suspense, a ton of tension within here, and it does elevate an animal, like I've spoken about earlier, to another level as a serious threat into that almost monster lane, I can see why it gets kind of put into that horror field. But I personally don't think it's a scary movie at all. I think it's a very enjoyable watch. I think it's got so many memorable moments from it. Obviously, it's super iconic in terms of cinema. I think its real world impact is underrated and under talked about, how it literally shaped the whole image of sharks as we know it today. I don't think there would be a Shark Week if it wasn't for Jaws, quite honestly. And that's for good and for bad that it did. But for its impact and for everything it did, it's definitely A tier. But in terms of horror, it's not a particularly scary movie to me. I don't think it really deserves to be considered a straight up like horror film. It is a cross genre film, unique in its own for sure. All right, we're getting down the list. Only got a few left. I don't think there's, in terms of horror characters, mascots, however you want to say, avatars, there's few that are as iconic as it, even though he is just a clown. I think it and Stephen King are probably the worst things to have ever happened to the clown industry. In terms of movies, this wasn't actually a straight movie when it first came out. It was a TV special that was done over, I think, maybe 3 specials. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but like 3 specials. Had Tim Curry in there, who definitely was playing against his typical type, but he did a phenomenal job. I remember watching this as a kid, and it stuck with me for I don't even know, for basically my whole life. Going back and rewatching it, you can see how rough it is. It's very rough. Visually, it does not hold up at all. But the impact it had was undeniable. Everybody was talking about it. I think he almost single-handedly created the whole clown phobia. And while the second half, particularly of the newer adaptations, has its problems, which is more of a story problem than a film problem, the modern versions, I think, again, are one of those rare versions where they're actually better than the original. And I really think, especially part one, they nailed what this character and this story was supposed to be. And while I don't find it particularly scary, especially the new ones, they're just so good to watch. They are very enjoyable to watch. I think they're extremely well done. And I think both actors who played Pennywise the Clown did phenomenal jobs. And as a franchise, and it's so ingrained in our zeitgeist that it is S tier. Evil Dead has a massive following, massive fan following, and for good reason. Bruce, I was about to say Buffer, but that is Bruce Campbell. I mean, this is what broke him. This is literally what broke him, and this is also what broke Sam Raimi, who is now a massive, big time director. So its influence and impact are undeniable. For such a small, low budget film to grow into the franchise it had is insane. It's very unique, even though it deals with the demonic and all that satanic tropes. It does it in such a unique way, and its tone is unlike almost any other films. It's almost as much a comedy as it is a horror now. So it's not very scary at all, but it's extremely bloody, extremely gory, and its tone is so unique and so standalone. And a lot of films have tried to kind of capture that essence after and have failed doing so. It's going to be A tier for me, particularly because it's not particularly scary in any way, shape, or form, but it is still very fun to watch. Another Stephen King movie. You could literally do a list of horror movies that were just Stephen King movies. I mean, that were just from Stephen King, because he has clearly a some would say fucked up mindset when it comes to storytelling, but he delivers some amazing things. Now, this is, for me, again, this is more of a thriller than necessarily a horror, but there are certainly some horror elements. Being kidnapped, taken hostage by a deranged individual is horrifying and terrifying. And the movie was super well done, to the point that it even was nominated for awards, which you don't really see a lot of movies in this genre getting. I want to say Kathy Bates won the award for this. It was that unsettling of a performance. And while And while it's not necessarily like I said, not necessarily scary or terrifying in the sense of a lot of horror you would expect, it is super unsettling. It does make you picture yourself in that situation and what you would do. And it does a phenomenal job of ratcheting up the tension all the way throughout the film. So for that, even though I don't necessarily think it is horror with a capital H, it in terms of films, it's a classic. So it's S tier. Poltergeist. I think it's another one of those super unique horror films. Almost like The Thing, where it stands alone on its own. It stands alone. I think its impact was pretty big. It has a lot of iconic, memorable moments from it. Very iconic lines. They're here is absolutely part of our pop culture. But it's also weird, like The Thing, in the sense that as well received critically and commercially, and as popular it is among the mainstream, nobody's ever been able to kind of recapture what they did in that film. I think it's such a unique film within the genre that does things that it's hard to spin off, and it's hard to create an overarching universe around. But as a standalone film, I think it was one of the best modern horror films ever made. So unique. Yeah. And I think it's up there. It's definitely up there. It's one of the greatest horror films I think ever made. S tier. It's crazy. I've literally seen every one of these movies. So much like Rec and obviously Blair Witch Project before, Paranormal Activity is another found footage film, and its impact was very similar to Blair Witch. Maybe not as big, not as people were not as hysterical, but definitely I definitely distinctly remember people believing this to be a true story, which is ridiculous. But it was unique. It was a unique film. I won't say original because obviously there have been plenty of found footage films before dealing with haunted homes and demons, but the way it was shot and the way it was set up was extremely unique. And the tension was incredibly high because they went day by day. So it really built up that tension over a good period of time. Now, I think the horror was pretty decent, like medium high. Even so, because you don't actually see what's antagonizing them. But this was a hit. This was a massive hit. So much so that it spawned like 5 or 6 sequels, prequels, and spinoffs. That I think decrease with each new entry, as films in this genre tend to do. But the original definitely still is iconic and stands up to the time. But I don't think it was necessarily that great of a franchise. I just think it hit at a time that people were like really looking for something like that. And for that is B tier. The OG himself, Michael Myers. He's still going. They just released the latest entry this year. It's crazy that he is still here and he's still going strong. I know for a lot of people, he is the one. He's the guy that people point to when it comes to horror, but for me, he definitely was not. He was probably my least favorite out of the big three at the time. And it was a unique franchise in the sense that they actually went away from him and tried to do more of an anthology type of approach, but then obviously went back to him because he became so iconic. Laurie Strode, I mean, Jamie Lee, like, she is the final girl. She's like literally the definition. You know what I mean? Like, when you think of the final girl trope, she pops into my mind. She's the one. She like nails it perfectly. So they definitely set the bar in terms of like a lot of slasher films, that final girl trope. I think they nailed it. I think they set the guidelines. They made the rules for what works in a film like this. But I don't actually think he's a particularly interesting character or antagonist. I think the kills are all pretty generic and bland for the most part. I don't necessarily find them to be super horrifying, terrifying, or scary. Doesn't speak. So I mean, I recognize its impact, its influence, and its longevity. But there's been a lot of missteps along the way, and for that, it's only an A tier. Child's Play. I don't think there's a more iconic doll than Chucky. I literally have a My Buddy black doll that basically looks just like Chucky. I'm pretty sure they based the character on this line of dolls that were out called My Little Buddy, and I had one of those. It was pretty fucked up to have. I remember watching Child's Play when I was like maybe 5 or 6. And even at that time, I didn't find them scary. I found it almost comical, but in a good way, where I think it did a good job of kind of meshing that more slapstick humor almost with the more slasher tropes that it was also going by. I think it was a very unique story and original. I think its sequels were absolutely dog shit, and I think they've only gotten worse over the years. But because he is such an iconic figure, there's always an audience for it. But if you actually look at the movies and in terms of horror, I think they're very, very lowbrow compared to everything else that is out there. Friday the 13th, Jason Voorhees himself. This is another one very similar to Michael Myers and Halloween, although in this series, the antagonist is far bigger than one single protagonist. It really doesn't matter. They're all just stand-ins for the stereotypes, the horror stereotypes that they're going for. He's not a very interesting character at all to me. He's just a walking murder machine. And that's fun and good for its moments. But as an overall franchise, it is a wildly varying degree of bad, downright terrible, to just okay. I don't necessarily think outside of the first there was any movie that was really standout. They even took him to space. That's how bad shit got. But in terms of iconic, obviously he's one of the most iconic characters in all of cinema. But if you actually look at the films and the movies, they are not very good. They are aggressively shitty. And for that, it's a C tier. think we got like 5 left. So this is a very deep cut cult film a lot of people have not seen. But for me, this is one of the most impactful horror films. This is the first and only movie I've ever walked out of. I was literally 8 years old. I was taking this movie basically on accident by my mother, who had no idea what this movie was about, and neither did I. And within the first 20 minutes, when I saw a person getting filleted and hung on hooks like a fish, I'm out. Looked at my mom. She looked at me. She grabbed her bag, and I beelined it for the door. That's how impactful this movie was for me as a child. It is a space horror that deals, I guess, with the satanic, basically, more or less. It basically opens a dimension of hell in space. And the ship is as creepy and as fucked up as anything else, as any other antagonist could be in a film. And it is kind of similar to the Hellraiser and the things and themes that it deals with as it brings out people's worst desires and flips it on them. It took me a while to go back and actually watch it. And watching it as an older child, it definitely was nowhere near as scary as it was for me when I was 8, but it was still a very unsettling watch, and I think it's one of the most underrated horror films to have ever come out. Doing space horror is hard, but this was space horror done right. So that's a B. It definitely has its faults. I'm not gonna say it was great all the way through, because it definitely had its moments where things just were not very good. What else we got? Yeah, I want to talk about this movie. Ravenous, another deep cut cult film that I don't think a lot of people have probably seen or even know about. It is a very unique film that I don't think would ever be made again. Something similar like this. Studios just don't take the chances like this, like on movies like this anymore, for good reasons. It didn't particularly do well, even though the cast was fairly strong. In short, it's a period piece of Wild West America back during Manifest Destiny, when everybody was running to California to stake their claim to things that weren't theirs to claim. But yeah. So you mix that in, throw in some cannibalism, straight up psychosis, Dead of Winter. It's very much inspired by like Donner Pass, what happened with that family, and you get one of the most disturbing movies I had ever seen in my life, at least up until that point. I don't remember exactly what age I saw it, but it was definitely too young. I don't want to spoil too much. It's a movie I suggest you see, but if you have a weak stomach, I might not go see it. They don't necessarily show a ton of things, but the implied act of a lot of things they do show is enough for it to be unsettling. And I think it's one of the most slept on films I've probably have on this entire list. I highly doubt I can meet more than 10 people 5 people that have actually seen this movie. But you should be one of those. You should definitely be one of those to see it. All right. We got like three more, something like that. Not sure. You guys can probably guess, maybe, what 3 I gotta talk about. But obviously, haven't talked about him yet. Nightmare on Elm Street. Freddy Krueger himself, Wes Craven himself. Out of all the mascot horror films, this was the one that I loved the most. The character, Freddy Krueger, is by far the most interesting antagonist out of any of the big 3 or 4, Mike Myers, Chucky, Jason, during that time period. Not only does he have great one-liners and is genuinely funny at times, he's also equally as scary and terrifying. And then when you add on to the fact that he attacks in your sleep when you are literally your most vulnerable, he plays on all of like your worst fears. It's so unique, so original, so iconic that it can be nothing less than S tier. It's an S tier franchise. And I don't care what any of you Jason fans think, any of you Mike Myers fans think. He is above you. Last 2. Midsommar. We were speaking about folk horror with The Wicker Man and how I said it did influence current movies. And one of those movies is definitely Midsommar, directed by Ari Aster. And this is his second debut. Well, not debut, because obviously his second feature film. Now, this one has a lot of mixed feelings from people. A lot of mixed feelings, and rightfully so. I have my own mixed feelings. It is a deeply disturbing, unsettling, uneasy feeling movie, but it's not particularly heavy on the horror in terms of big capital H horror. But like I said, it is disturbing, and there are a lot of moments in this film that still stick with me to this day. The ending in particular, I will never be able to look at a bear costume the same again. I think the acting was phenomenal. Florence Pugh, amazing in this movie. But it's a weird one. It's not a movie I particularly like, but it is one I think that most people should see for the unique approach she does to things. And the story is uneasy, unsettling, disturbing. It's not a particularly scary one, though. And it's not my favorite movie, but it's one of those that if you get a chance, you should just see it. But in terms of horror movies, nah, it's D tier. It is a D tier, unfortunately. Last movie we're going to talk about, one of my favorite movies to have come out in the past decade plus, at least, Hereditary. Ari Aster, who I just spoke about when he made Midsommar, he made Hereditary, and it was his debut feature film, and it was a hell of a debut. How do you debut a movie like this? Like, this movie is fucked up, and not even in the way like super gory. There are some disturbing moments dealing with body horror for sure, but the psychological buildup in this film is intense. It opens up with a bang. and it lets you know right from the start where things are going, and then it kind of slowly builds you into things, slowly lulls you into like a sense of, all right, maybe this isn't so bad, and then the ending comes, and those last 20 minutes are just horror masterclass, to say the least. He deals with similar tropes, folky, witchy, sacrifice, cult issues that he continued to explore in Midsommar, but he does so from a much, much darker space on this one. And it's all an allegory for family drama in the most fucked up possible way. And it's one of the only movies where I've literally sat down with somebody to watch it, in which they literally started crying and sobbing from it. So from that alone, man, this is an S tier and one of the best horror movies to have come out in the past 10 to 15 years, and an absolute must watch. Well, that's it. We went through 51 movies, horror movies, and ranked them all for you, the listener, the reader. We do this all for you. For this Halloween, if there's a movie on this list, which I'm sure there are that you haven't seen, and you want to go see some good movies for Halloween, just go by our ranking. Check it out. It's pretty solid. And it's crazy. I've seen every one of these movies. Every one. Looking back, I don't know how I wasn't more fucked up child watching some of this shit. But if anything, it made it more interesting. It could make you more interesting too. Go watch them. Check them out. Halloween is here. And you have a phenomenal list to get you through this year's holiday.